So just to give a little bit of background on Apple Retail, it employs 70,000 employees, and it represents roughly half of the workforce of Apple's global workforce. So it's a pretty significant organization, and it's a very different organization from the rest of Apple. So prior to coming over and leading that team, I worked in a variety of functions and roles focused on strategic operations and analytics within finance. And so it was sort of a natural inclination to move into the people analytics space, and that was one of the value that I was providing to that. So just to give you a little bit of sense of who I am, I'm actually Canadian. I am a mother. I'm the oldest sibling of 4 kids, so I'm very well prepared for chaos and thriving in unstructured environments. And so I really wanted to share with you today around what I'm calling essentially a network approach to elevating people analytics and people data. And what that really means is that how do we really get to a place of using people, data, and analytics to drive workforce innovation and strategies? They're often very sort of disconnected, and I wanted to essentially share my journey with that. So I think the first thing is to look at this as a transformation type issue. I've spent 20 years in the workforce and largely really focused on transformation. Prior to Apple, I spent the first 10 years of my life as a management consultant with Deloitte Consulting. And I was focused on working for various different Fortune 500 companies on different transformational types of initiatives. Then I spent the next 10 years at Apple working in a variety of roles that really entailed transformational types of things, whether or not it was introducing new functions or new business operational strategy, or really trying to embed business intelligence and data intelligence into the way that we were making decisions and informing our strategies. And so I have a really keen sense of transformation. I know it when I see it. I know that it is difficult, it is exhausting, and it requires a perseverance. And so when I stepped into the space of people analytics in 2015, since then I've been really excited to see sort of the transgression of people analytics and how it's evolving. There are many organizations that are now have a small or a large people analytics groups within their company. We're seeing also many conferences, this one being one of the pioneers in this space, that is really excelling the conversation, the topic around people analytics. And within our schools and our colleges, they're starting to embed people analytics into the curriculum. And I was recently talking with the faculty member on behalf of the Wharton People Analytics program, and was really sort of asking about sort of what is drawing people into the space, what are drawing some students into the space. And it was largely because they feel that this is a new and exciting place. There's a lot of innovation that's happening in here, and they feel that they can really make and help shape where this is going. So all in all, it's a great and it's an exciting time. There's a lot of opportunity. There's a lot of innovation that is taking place in this space. I will say, though, a recent Oracle survey highlighted, they asked about the area that is most needed to develop or improve analytics skills for HR. And it ranked as the highest choice was acting on data and analytics to solve issues. So there's no doubt that as exciting as time as this may be, we need to understand that to drive HR to really embed analytics into their workforce strategies and innovating with that, and doing that in an evidence-based way, we need to be thinking very much of this in a sort of a transformative way, and how do we approach that? So from my standpoint, this is why I'm calling it a network approach to driving this transformation around how we act on data and analytics within the organization and really embed that in. So from my standpoint, and what I'm going to share with you of what I did at Apple, this means being very purposeful in structuring mechanisms and various different management systems that drive cross-functional alignment on the areas of focus and the problems to solve for an organization. It means being very thoughtful around how you are aligning your data and analytics priorities to align to those focus areas and organizational problems. And it also means connecting teams across the organizations to solve for some of these complex problems and come up with the best solutions to really be able to make the workforce changes that we can do. So the agenda for today, what I wanted to at least take you through is provide some context of my journey at my team at Apple, walk and share essentially what I'm sort of calling a playbook that I use to elevate the people analytics functions to drive true workforce innovation and strategies. I want to outline some of the headwinds that we face and also highlight some of the key success factors that we felt that were absolutely critical in being able to get to this level and elevate the use of the data. So just walking through my team journey, we were formed in FY15. The initial focus of this was on retail talent analytics. And really, we came into the organization. They had never had this function previously. And they were really asking us to create an analytics functions that we could create better strategies, recruiting strategies, make a greater impact, and also have greater operational effectiveness in the way that we worked and we did things. So we focused on that. Not long after that, about a year later, our remit expanded to include strategic operational initiatives. So it wasn't just simply pulling together and getting the analytics themselves. It was actually trying to drive sort of change using those findings and analytics. Following that, the team scope expanded even more to include driving analysis that involves spanning across all of the people functions. So what this really entailed was that we sort of saw from the talent acquisition space, there was only so much that you could do within that function. Really, ultimately, you needed to be much more connected across many of the different people functions. So we were elevated to essentially solve for analytics and problems across all of people. And then not long after that, as you can see, then that evolved into people strategy. So not just simply doing the analytics, but really using the data and the analytics to drive sort of strategy and changes that we were looking to make more broadly within an organization that entails 700,000 employees. So as you can see through here, there's sort of a consistent pattern of an initial remit that is focusing on people analytics, and then expanding to include a strategic execution element in order to really drive change. So, and this didn't happen by accident. It happened twice, and the reason is I sort of took essentially a four-step approach that I at least wanted to share with you guys today around how we ended up elevating the function. And then also just give you some examples in really what was some use cases around how we made strategic changes. So before going into that, I at least wanted to just provide my point of view and perspective on why the challenges of forming an analytics teams and what you're typically faced. This is what we were faced with when we were forming a new team. I'm not sure if you guys also were faced with this. But ultimately, initially, you're viewed as simply as a source for data. You can be siloed, and I'll speak at least on our behalf. We were siloed. We didn't have a seat at the table. We weren't able to make the influence that we really felt like we could. We were often engaged too late, and we felt that our true value, and the team felt like the true value had not yet been discovered. And so as you take a look back at this, my point of view is that one of the driving forces is that in organizations, much like society, we're organized in traditional hierarchy structure, where specific functions and capabilities are largely independent. And so in some regards, this is a natural outgrowth of what I see in terms of Adam Smith's original thesis on specialization of labor to drive, ideal economic benefit. And this has largely influenced how our organizations have been shaped, and as well as our career structures have evolved for the last century. We're sort of based on very sort of specialized areas. But the reality of solving some of the very complex problem is the realization that our world is much more complex, interconnected, and a little bit messy. So when it comes to solving problems that the discipline of people analytics can really support to drive workforce innovation and strategies, is you have to take this into account and essentially adapt yourself and understand this system to operate in. So as I drove my team forward, this is something I really wanted to take into consideration and understand how I needed to navigate myself through this. So the first step and sort of the 4 steps that I'm sort of highlighting in terms of the purposeful approach around really being able to sort of tackle this more complex system to solving business problems or people problems was 4 steps. One is, taking the time to focus on building your foundation. 2, establishing credibility. 3, elevating the conversation. And 4, seek connections. So I'll go through each of those. So in terms of building the foundation, given that the end goal is to strive for evidence-based strategies that is driving innovation in sort of workforce, the most basic step that we had to start with, and many people analytics teams start with, is sort of building a foundation of a good platform of data in which then you can layer on various, more advanced sort of analytical type tools. And so from our standpoint, what we wanted to do is be very, very thoughtful in defining our path forward, where we wanted to be, realizing that this was going to take some time and that there would be iterations towards that. This is not an easy thing whenever you are looking at an HR environment, just like many environments within the business. Data sources are very decentralized, connecting data can be complex, and so you have to really sort of spend the time in establishing this foundational aspect to eventually drive towards really great people analytics and data. So from our standpoint, we just defined where we were today and where we wanted to be, and we wanted to just communicate that really effectively to our team and our stakeholders around how we were operating. So we looked at 3 different aspects. We looked at the people. We saw that in our current state, our people didn't have a data mindset and it wasn't embedded into what they were doing. So the future that we saw was that we wanted to empower our teams with data intelligence, and that we saw it really integrated in the way that they were shaping and forming their strategy and driving their operations for the highest degree of effectiveness. From a process standpoint, we looked at it in terms of our current environment, which was a proliferation of reports. I think at the time we did an inventory of about 150 different reports that existed across the organization. We had many different metrics, and the sort of lack of credibility of the data was an issue, and actually embedding data and telling stories as well didn't exist. And so our future was that we would essentially have standardized reporting. We would have standard metrics with clear methodologies, behind that, and we would have an embedded sort of common language and data accuracy throughout the organization. And then finally, from a technology standpoint, we had multiple integrated sources of data. So we were really looking to the nirvana space where we have an integrated platform and built on analytics tools. So again, this is just really helpful in helping to communicate where we were going and helping take along our stakeholders along the journey around this. The second step was establishing our credibility. In this particular case, in a human system network, its relationships are really, really important. We're social creatures designed to be recognized, understood, and valued. And so we really need to take this into incorporation when working with stakeholders, especially as a new team. So we set out to be really focused in proving our value and our credibility in various different ways. One was just providing accurate data. And that didn't just mean our HR stakeholders, our finance stakeholders, our business stakeholders. We really needed to prove that we were doing this. We wanted to establish rigor in the analysis. We wanted to implement a consistent way of working so they could understand how we engaged with them. We spent the time really listening and identifying areas for opportunities. And we were focused on building relationship with a particular focus on a service mindset around how we could be providing value. So the next step was then elevating our conversation. So as we focused on building, our foundation and communicating really effectively where we were going with that, we were seeing success with building our credibility. We felt that this was the moment then to elevate the conversation. And we did that really, essentially what that means is how do we align on an organization on the problems to solve? So in doing this required establishing several mechanisms as part of a management system in order to do that. First was establishing a strategic business planning process, which really highlighted, as an organization, where are the things we want to focus on, where do we think are the biggest problems and opportunities that we need to solve for in developing solutions and workforce strategies. The second was implement governance, and the focus on that was really highlighting, ensuring that we were holding ourselves accountable and executing on those things that we had decided on about what we thought we needed to solve. The third was being very, very thoughtful around building stakeholder partnerships, because this was going to be a new way of working and being very, very cross-functional. And so establishing very healthy and functional stakeholder partnerships is extremely important. And then finally, creating an integrated roadmap. And this was just to provide visibility of all of the strategic initiatives from a people standpoint that we were focused on, that everyone had visibility to that, but then also that intersected with the business initiatives as well, so we could be really clear around how we were trying to make an impact on the workforce. So in the interest of time, I won't go through this in various different detail, but I at least want to show about how people analytics started to then get woven within each of these mechanisms and how they were started to be much more elevated. So what the strategic business planning process enabled, that system enabled a way for the organization to highlight and really identify their focus areas. Where people analytics was able to come in and play is right up front in a defining sort of the inputs into that process. Any research or findings around where were some opportunities around sort of our people, where were some problem areas that they could see, opportunities that they could see that could really feed into this process for the leadership. Once then the decisions were filtered and they decided on, here's absolutely what we need to focus on, this was raised all the way up into the board at Apple, to the CEO at Apple. We were then able to have a very clearly defined set of focus areas that we were trying to solve for the year, that everybody had visibility into and could align their priorities and initiatives against. So from a people analytics standpoint, this really allowed to, now you have visibility and you can get engaged in the right way. So then the next piece around the governance operating model, which was, once we got these focus areas, everyone was really, really excited. We're going to solve all these problems. It's going to be really, really great. But day-to-day business things happen, and you can kind of get pulled in various different directions. So we implemented a governance model to keep us on track. And that entailed having sponsors sort of initiatives at an executive level. It involved core cross-functional teams who were working on ways around how we could solve these problems and develop strategies around this. It also involved extended leadership teams, so how we were communicating to the broader community and bringing them along for the journey. It had a steering committee, executive leadership, and board. So just communications. And really we designed this because this was the most effective way, and the various different systems that needed to be put in place, but each company really has to define what works best. But this worked well for us. And then finally, in terms of our stakeholder ecosystem, we wanted to ensure that there was visibility into all the stakeholders. People understood each other's purpose. From an analytics teams, that we were able to communicate our value. We could understand the interconnections between each of the different stakeholders and build a partnership relationship across them. And finally, create engagement mechanisms when working with this. Because as I mentioned, in a hierarchical structure, it's not natural to work cross-functionally. So what this was doing was understanding how you could do that. And then finally, integrated roadmap. I don't think I have to go into this into a significant amount of detail. This is such simple concept, yet a powerful tool in creating transparency and the interconnections between various different initiatives. Engaging sort of a cadence and a review and a planning allowed us to continue the executional and tactical elements of this, and also think about how we were planning for and launching these things in a coordinated way from a people and a business aspect. So the next is around, the next step is around seeking connections. So the focus really on this is to solve complex problems, there needs to be a real stitching of some of the best of the company together. So seeking connections is creating a way in how you can do that, realizing that you're working in a much more sort of specialized and hierarchical way. So what we did was we created a cross-functional methodology. The purpose of this methodology was essentially just to create a structured way in the way that we would work cross-functionally. So we had an intake process, which was largely fed in through the strategic business planning process, but also allowed for things that came up perhaps during the year that was outside of the scope of the focus areas. Then there was a series of steps that we would go through with every type of sort of complex business problem that we were looking to solve. We would scope it, we would plan for it, we would do a discovery process, which largely involved the people analytics teams and really understanding the problem and the landscape that we were trying to solve. We would go through ideation and design sessions, which was largely design thinking collaborative sessions across the cross-functional teams. We would have a build process, approving, which was testing and piloting what we were doing, and there was a launching and a postmortem around how we were measuring the effectiveness of the strategies that we were doing and refining them. And underneath this all, we had very clear sort of methodology activities and supporting assets, project reporting structure that was clear in terms of roles and responsibilities of these small cross-functional teams, and then also a very clear outline of how stakeholders are going to be engaged to this process. So we didn't want to put this might look like a lot of structure, and that wasn't really the intent. It was really just the guide around how we would be helping to change a different way of working, of really connecting people data to drive strategy and do it in an evidence-based way. So I'll give an example, two examples of which this was essentially realized. The first example that I'll share is around talent planning. So many companies are experiencing exponential workforce growth and then sort of almost a plateauing. So you'll have like a huge amount of organizational, you're bringing in headcount, there's a lot of structure, and in that type of environment, there's a lot of sort of movement and change and sort of working your way through in various different sort of paths and so forth from a talent standpoint. But the challenge becomes once you start plateauing is that it can be difficult keeping employees engaged and developed with opportunities, as there are certain dynamics that start to happen. So some of the things that we saw was that promotions were starting to decrease. We saw that the tenure crunch, in particular as you moved up the ladder, we saw that the tenure crunch was worsening due to the lack of these movement opportunities that were happening. We also saw consistent feedback, as we often do, around the talent wanted more development opportunities. We also looked at the talent planning process, that how by design it wasn't applied consistently. So it couldn't be used as in a way around how to execute a large-scale strategy change because of the way that it was being applied and because of its methodology being more decentralized. And we also delved into many other aspects around talent, around how their evolving expectations and desires were, particularly around areas such as flexibility and what that really meant. So the organization knew they had a problem, our business environment and talent expectations were evolving. How do we adapt our talent planning strategies to help facilitate more talent movement and development opportunities? And they talked about it a lot, but there was no concerted, broad action that was happening that impacted our people. So the formulation of a cross-functional strategy that involved HR business partners, learning development, people analytics, people ops, business, employee experience, people strategy, and along with sort of our cross-functional methodology, enabled that team to then get together to define how we needed to essentially do that. And in the interest of time, I won't go through that, but I'm happy to talk through that after this. Another way in which we applied this was through business critical events. So business critical events at Apple, particularly in the retail space, can only be analyzed, respond to, plan for in a very, very cross-functional way. So what we wanted to do was, given our business environmental experiences around this, what we had seen before, how should we be evolving our workforce and people strategies to make a greater impact? So what we did was we looked at a couple of different things by creating a cross-functional team and diving into a previous business event. One, we wanted to assess the impact on the timing response to the staffing needs against the business demand, and that we saw that once the staffing needs were filled, business demand started decreasing. So we knew that the staffing strategy was the right thing to do, but we were looking at the timing of it was not effective because there was a peak in demand. Next, we also looked at our employees, and we looked at their call-outs, because to us this was an indicator of stress. And we saw that as the peak in demand started to hit, and we hadn't yet implemented the staffing strategies, we started to see an exponential level of call-outs that were occurring that we had not seen typically historically. So in that case, that was sort of an indicator to us that our employees were stressed, but that stress started to go down as soon as we implemented the staffing strategy. So we wouldn't have been able to come up in a coordinated way to really look at how we change doing this, change our ways of coordinating our efforts around this, particularly around the timing of when staffing strategies need to be executed, and then as well as what are some particular people strategies that we can help the workforce around when they're dealing with these types of stresses. So again, I would go through this in detail, but in the interest of time, happy to answer some questions after this around that. So taking a step back around the headwinds, again, what you're going to be faced with in making this, and this is what we were faced with, was working cross-functionally goes across the grain, but you need to do this in order to solve very complex people problems and make a change. There's going to be a natural reaction to change. It's not our natural state, and we need to be prepared for that. And building a new organizational capability muscle takes time, so there needs to be patience along with that and perseverance through that. From a success factor to really doing this, you need, and we needed, leadership support and buy-in, and it had to be an all-in approach, couldn't be sort of halfway. We needed our leadership team and our general population to have an awareness of the change dynamics, that there is a legacy bias, or this is how we do things. We operate in sort of our own sort of functional ways, and this is a completely new way of working. We needed to ensure that we were empowering the team with the right capability and the skills to do this, and we needed to ensure that the resources were there for the team in order to effectively execute on this piece. So where we ended up with is a very successful enabler for problem solving. We were structured effectively to engage, to not just be producing data and people analytics, but really to be embedding them into our strategies. We were on the leadership team. We had a seat at the table with that. We were successful in our efforts around evolving the organization to a data-first mindset. And we felt like we were proving, our value and really optimizing what this function could do for the organization. And that's it. Thank you.
Thanks. Hi. So I had a question about the strategic business planning component, and can you talk a little bit about how you tied a strategic workforce plan to the business initiatives? Kind of what went into that?
Yeah. So from a strategic workforce planning standpoint, that was embedded as part of operational strategies. So There was a couple of different things. Each of our functions had their own workforce planning, and we were helping to essentially develop that. So for instance, talent acquisition, we developed a hiring demand forecast. We built capacity models to essentially predict or to identify what they would need in terms of staffing needs. So each of these we were doing with each of the different functions around workforce planning and creating models that would essentially do that. But for some of these cross-functional types of problems, which were a little bit more different, what we were doing is effectively, as part of our scoping, our planning process, having a very deliberate identification of the resource needs that we had, and a process for how we got approval, for that. So if that meant that we needed to dive into the functions, which we often did, to bring them into these initiatives, we did that. Or in some cases, we may have to bring in additional resources as part of that. So I don't know if that's answering your question, but yeah, it was sort of a two-pronged approach, one more functionally based and a strategy around operational strategies and models for that, and the other much more sort of cross-functional for these bigger problems.